the eternal deity of Christ as God the Son. Now, I have to confess that that is the way, for many years, the way that I understood this particular text. And I would say that that understanding of it is partly correct, because that is implied in what Paul says here, that the resurrection does prove the fact that he really is the eternal Son of God. But after carefully studying this passage, I'm convinced that there's something more that Paul is talking about in this particular text. You see, the contrast between verse 3 and verse 4 is not between what Christ is in terms of his human nature, Son of David, and what Christ is in terms of his divine nature, Son of God. That's not the contrast. No, the contrast is between two successive stages or phases of Christ's experience as the God-man, as the incarnate God-man. Two successive stages of his experience after God the Son took to himself a human body and soul. What theologians refer to as his state of humiliation as the God-man, and his state of exaltation as the God-man. Now, let me explain why I think the translation declared is not the best, and what I'm convinced this passage is actually talking about. Let me try to get your consciences with regard to that. First of all, there is no clear-cut example of this Greek verb actually meaning to declare, we are told, in the first century Greek. Now, obviously, I haven't read everything that was ever written in first century Greek to be able to clarify that or to confirm that. But I will say this same word is used 7 times in the New Testament itself. And in all of its other 7 occurrences, in the context, it clearly means to determine, to appoint, to fix, or to ordain. For example, this is the word used in Acts 10:42, referring to Christ. Peter says, "And he commanded us to preach to the people and to testify that it is he who was ordained," here's the word, "by God to be judge of the living and the dead." There is translated ordained. Jesus was ordained or appointed by God to be judge. It's the same word found in Acts 17:31, again referring to Jesus. Paul says, "Because God has fixed the day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by the man whom he has appointed." There's our word. "He has given assurance of this to all by raising him from the dead." So my point is, it would be more accurate to translate the word here in our text, appointed. He was appointed, ordained Son of God with power by the resurrection from the dead. Now, one of the reasons some translators have been hesitant to translate it that way is because that sounds like Paul is saying that Jesus was not the Son of God from eternity, but that he became the Son of God by the resurrection, that the resurrection somehow made Jesus God. So the tendency has been to translate the phrase "declared the Son of God" instead of "appointed Son of God." But again, the fact is that what Paul actually says, strictly speaking, is appointed the Son of God with power. And I believe if we miss that, I think we're going to miss something very wonderful and glorious that Paul is referring to here. By using this word appointed or ordained, Paul is not suggesting that Jesus becomes God the Son only at the time of his resurrection. You remember up in verse 3. Paul has already told us that the gospel is concerning God's Son who was born. Literally, who became of the seed of David according to the flesh. And the placement there of the words "his Son" in verse 3, before the descriptions that follow, point to the fact that he was already God's Son before these events occurred. He is and ever was and ever will be eternal God the Son. The Word was made flesh. The Word was with God, and the Word is God.